Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Wrestling Doesn't Make Sense. It's a show where me and John go through wrestling history and talk about some shit that makes sense and or doesn't make any sense. So recently, what has happened in the wide world of professional wrestling is the Big Show, formerly known as the Big Show, I should say, because he's no longer the Big Show. He is Paul Wight, because that's his actual name, his non-copyrighted name. Paul Wight.
I thought it was Paul Wight.
Oh, there's no R?
I'm pretty sure there isn't.
Oh boy, that's why he's been so pissed at me every time I see him. I've been calling him Krandel. Paul Wight. I mean, fuck. Well, that's the thing. For the last 20 years, nobody's called him that. They called him the Big Show.
Mm-hmm.
So he's formerly the Big Show. Paul Wight. God, can I go 5 seconds without making a dick out of myself? Paul Wight, the Big Show, the former Big Show, is now contracted to All Elite Wrestling, which is wild because a lot of people. He was one of those big WWE guys that were like, this, you know, you didn't even think of him going to All Elite Wrestling because you would think, number one, he's been with the WWE for so long that like he's probably got some kind of ties there, you know. But also number two, you think it's 2021, like. We had this conversation with Sting like fucking 4 weeks ago. Like, what's he gonna do? What's the Big Show? Well, we got our answer. The Big Show is going to do commentary on All Elite Wrestling's second YouTube show. Not even the main YouTube show. He's going to do commentary on their second YouTube show.
Yeesh.
And I'm like, dude, once again, when we're talking about All Elite Wrestling, none of that shit makes any sense. Like, what the fuck? Like, what a great use of the Big Show. Just astounding, this company, man.
But this is the thing as well, though. Like, he could have been a bigger deal of a signing than Sting, really, considering all of his, you know, longevity with WWE and, like, all the things he did over there. And the fact that, you know, he was still, you know, kind of wrestling. Not often, but you know, more often than Sting has over the last 5 or 6 years. So,
right.
You know, he could have been a big deal, but like you say, they shuffle him off to second YouTube show.
They put him on the second YouTube show, and they announced it on Twitter. Like, okay, here's the thing. You know, whenever Sting appeared, right?
Yeah.
Sting turned up with a baseball bat, and he kind of like shooed people away, didn't he?
Pretty much.
He didn't do anything like big, but he was there. People were like, "It's Sting," and then he was kind of like, "I'm here, and I've got a baseball bat." And now you know what the deal is, right? Yeah. Nothing really happened. You know, no angle was set up. The angle was that Sting was there.
Yeah, right? Essentially.
Since then, it seems like they found shit for Sting to do. Whether or not that's good or not, a whole different question, but. No, it's like backwards booking, right? They have Sting. What do we do with him? And then they figure out shit to do with Sting. But like, if you had the Big Show, formerly known as Paul Krandel, if you had the Big Show, like, what if you just had him like, you didn't stick around with it on Twitter? People were watching because what happened with that Sting episode was Sting just turned up. It was a random show. And like, although there was rumblings, right? There was rumblings. People were suspicious because Sting had stopped that deal with the WWE and their merchandise. So people were like, shit's going down. And then a couple of weeks later, Sting appeared for All Elite Wrestling. But nobody thought about that shit for the Big Show. So what if just on this week's episode of All Elite Wrestling, Big Show just turned up and fucking chokeslammed like Cody Rhodes, right?
Exactly, yeah.
People would be like, what the fuck? Whoa! And the thing is, like you said about the Big Show, he's still got a good year in him, year or two. Like that guy can still go, right? And that's presumably why he went to All Elite Wrestling, is to kind of like live out the last year or two of his pro career, kind of on a high and do something, you know?
Yeah.
And it wasn't his time to retire yet, and so but like, wouldn't that have made like a fucking? You could use him for shit. And it would have been a impact. Like, whoa, the Big Show. Instead of that, you just got a load of people like me going, what the fuck? You know, because we hear about it on Twitter, and you're like, so
Yeah, I mean,
big deal.
as well, like obviously you've got Shaq coming in to face Cody Rhodes like this week on Dynamite.
Right, they're right.
And like there was that big tease for like Big Show versus Shaq a few years ago, and it was supposed to happen at WrestleMania and never did happen.
Uh,
This would have been the perfect way to bring him in as like, you know, after that match is finished, holy shit, there's Big Show and he's walking up to Shaq looking for a fight. Why not
right,
do that?
right. What if that was the show? What if they had that happen and the whole yada yada goes on, and then suddenly after the match, Big Show comes out and like choke slams Shaquille O'Neal.
Mm-hmm.
That would be huge. People would freak out, right? Even though nobody, I maintain that nobody wants to see Shaquille O'Neal versus the Big Show, formerly known as whatever I called him earlier, in 2021. Like nobody wanted to see that 5 years ago. Nobody wants to see it now. But like that would have been an impact, right? That would have been cool. And they didn't do that. They were just like, here's a Big Show. They just all the time, man. They do stuff like this. Well, let me tell you how it could have been done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because today's show is going to be all about people jumping ship, as they say. Because back in the 90s, and even before the 90s, really, ish, big names would kind of like be built up in one territory or one company, one promotion, and then would jump ship to a different company, promotion, what have you, with that kind of momentum behind them. It happened a lot from WWF to WCW because WCW had a lot of lucrative contracts that they were willing to piss money into. Right? Doesn't that sound familiar? And so a lot of people jumped from the WWF to WCW. And I think one of the more infamous ones, and I assume you were thinking about this too, it's got to be this guy that we talk about first, is Rick Rude.
Yeah.
Because in the midst of this whole war between WWF and WCW, Rick Rude was, back in the day, Raw used to tape an episode and then do an episode live. Or I should say do an episode live and then tape the next week's episode.
Mm.
So they were live like, 2 Mondays a month-ish. And WCW have used this to their advantage a couple of times. And one way they did that was Rick Rude was on a taped episode of Raw that would air on Monday night. And then he, like the rude character that he is, turned up live on Nitro. So he was on both TV shows at the same time because one of them was taped. And I don't quite know what the issue was. I guess he just was fed up with the pay or whatever. Maybe
I think it was to do with the Montreal Screwjob, because this was like the day after, I believe, or the week after, possibly. But the day after the Screwjob is when they taped Raw, and had the live Raw. But he did that and then basically went off to WCW because he was working on a pay-per appearance deal, so he wasn't even locked down by WWF at the time.
Wasn't he in ECW at some point as well?
Yeah, that same year he was. I think he kind of came in as like this random mass man character, kind of coming after Shane Douglas and Francine before like eventually sort of joining up with them and being like a manager to the Triple Threat. But then he kind of turned heel on ECW during the whole like Jerry Lawler, RVD, and Sabu angle where they were like supposedly working for WWF at the time. And that pretty much led to him, making appearances as the insurance policy for DX on Raw.
Yes, I do remember that. Very interesting. I mean, like he wasn't contracted though, so like, is that really kind of jumping ship? I don't know. But then it's the same with the Big Show, right? Same as Sting. So let's kind of count that as jumping ship. So to go along with these scenarios, we're gonna explain to people. To go along with all of these different cases of jumping ship, I'm gonna ask you a question to go along with them. We're gonna have a fun little game. Hooray! And it's basically the old Tony Schiavone saying, did it put butts in seats?
Right.
Did this jump change anything? Did it make a difference? You know what I mean? Because that's what some people think. They want to jump ship so they can get more attention or notoriety or even just money, right? So, but they always think of it in terms of like, is it going to make a difference for ratings or the quality of the show, yada yada. So, in that case, you can say that Rick Rude appearing on like Raw and Nitro at the same time, a really good power move, you know, really good. Like, yeah, heck yeah, shots fired. However, Rick Rude being in WCW, I would say, was a minor deal. It made no difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was essentially retired and had been for a long time by that point anyway, so he could only really come in as a manager and, you know...
not do much.
Exactly. You're not going to make a big splash as a manager. And he was managing Kurt Hennig, who kind of didn't really need a manager as well, so, you know, it wasn't really destined to be a huge success.
No, I would say that didn't put butts in seats. Speaking of that whole deal, you remember whenever Medusa went from the WWF to WCW?
Mm-hmm.
Because she was the women's champion.
Yeah.
She was the WWF women's champion, and she got enticed by, you know, I think she got enticed by both the monetary aspect and also the promise that she would have a women's division to work around. Because one of the problems in WWF at the time was that the women's division wasn't super populated.
Mm-hmm.
So she wanted more of a challenge, and WCW promised that to her. So she turns up on an episode of Nitro with the WWF Women's Championship, and she says, "This is what I think of this fucking thing." I paraphrased. They didn't say that on Nitro. And she takes the Women's Championship and like just puts it into a rubbish bin and says, "There you go. Now I'm WCW for life." Again, ballsy move, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, from what I've heard, has left Vince McMahon very bitter because, you know, they disrespected his championship on their TV show. You know, understandably so. So he was very, you know, disheartened by that whole thing. So again, really good power move. Made them look like, you know, yeah, look what we can do. However, WCW's women's division, you could argue, turned out to be worse than the WWF's.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Women's division, because A, they didn't have one. B, they set one up for Medusa, and I don't think she won the belt. As I recall, Medusa did not win the WCW Women's Championship.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think so.
So what? Good booking all around by WCW. Like, my goodness, like, why go to all that effort? Why? Because that must have been a pain in the ass with like lawsuits and shit. Why do that just for no payoff? At least use it, you know. And then she was a cruiserweight champion, I think.
Yeah, she was.
Which tells you what, you know, they were dicking around with a cruiserweight title. They didn't give a shit about that either. Because wasn't Oklahoma also the cruiserweight champion?
I get the feeling she may have lost the belt to Oklahoma.
That's the women's division in WCW. My friend.
yeah.
That's what you get. So Medusa going to WCW.
That did not put any butts in seats.
Did not put butts in seats, I would say. So it's not looking so good for the WCW side.
But it's funny that like Vince was, you know, stung by that. His champion going off to the main rivals and then doing something with the belt, because, you know, he did something similar with bringing in Ric Flair in '91, where, you know, Ric Flair had been the face of like the NWA for years and years, like, you know, held the world title multiple times and for huge stretches, and, you know, he was the leader of the Four Horsemen and everything, but then sort of ran into all these issues with Jim Herd at the time, who was WCW president, who you know, allegedly wanted him to shave his head and wear an earring and change his name to Spartacus.
Yeah, I
And
mean, that makes sense to me.
of course, but not to Ric Flair though. So he kind of refused all that, got fired by Jim Herd. But because at the time, like the champions had to pay a deposit to kind
Yes.
of carry the belts, so because of all the issues with Jim Herd and WCW, they wouldn't pay him back his deposit. So Ric Flair kept the belt and pretty much just showed up on WWF TV with it. Well, I guess Bobby Heenan like showed the belt off first to kind of hype his coming, but that whole angle was brilliant, and it made it feel like a huge deal that Ric Flair was coming over to WWF. And it was a huge deal because him and Hogan were, you could say, the biggest stars of their respective promotions in the 80s. So the idea of like a dream match between them was something that I guess most fans would have wanted to see. The irony being that we didn't really ever see it in WWF because the house
Hey,
show reviews weren't so good when they tried it out. But you know.
I like how house show reviews weren't so good when they tried it in what was that 91, 90?
It was sort of late 91, maybe early 92.
Yeah. So the reviews weren't good in late 1991. So the WWF said this is no good.
Mm.
And somebody along the way didn't hear that memo at all because didn't they, I'm sure they fought in WCW, right?
Oh, yeah,
Didn't
absolutely.
didn't they fight in TNA?
Probably.
I mean, which is long after they should have been fighting. That's you guys should have put a little cap on that. But I think that like that whole thing, and that like Flair was only in the WWF for like what 2 years or something.
Yeah, under 2 years, I think it was.
So then he went back to WCW, which I think everybody kind of saw coming, right?
Mm,
But like just him kind of being there to begin with was a big deal.
yeah.
Like that was huge, and like you said, him bringing the belt with him and shit, like it felt big. And I'm sure you'll agree with this that I'd say that did put butts in seats, right?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Like, think of the feud with Randy Savage, which really stuck out, and the fact that he won the world title a couple of times as well, and ended up dropping it to Bret Hart, which like set Bret Hart up as like the next big babyface champion in WWF for like the next few years as well. So his run in WWF was only short, but it was really, really like influential.
He did a lot in those like 2 years.
Mm.
I think he won the Royal Rumble, and was he heavyweight champion twice?
Yeah, so I think he lost it to Randy Savage, but then won it back from Savage. I think it was Savage anyway. But yeah, then he lost it to Bret Hart on what was essentially like a house show, but I think it was still taped and shown on like an episode of Superstars or something back in the day.
Oh, good old superstars.
Mm.
So yeah, that one put some butts in seats.
Yeah.
Excellent work, Ric Flair. And while we're talking about Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan, we could talk about Hulk Hogan going from the WWF to WCW, because I think at some point Vince was like, "All right, Hogan, we got a lot of years out of you, but we got to focus on the new generation of people."
Yeah.
Hulk Hogan said, "Fuck that. I'm going to the company that doesn't give a shit about the new generation of people." And I think Hogan went first, and then Savage joined him later, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Savage was
definitely.
working as a commentator,
Yes.
and he didn't like being forcefully retired. I think he didn't enjoy that at all. He wanted to keep wrestling, so he moved to WCW. And here's the thing, man. These seem like they should have been big deels. They feel like they should have been big gets. But like Hogan going to WCW, like, kind of felt like a big deal. But once he was there, he was still doing the old, red and yellow Hulkamaniacs, better eat your vitamins and yada yada. And people weren't weren't buying it. So, infamously, people weren't buying it, so they kind of like doubled down on like making Hogan look invincible. Like, no, he's really good. Look at him beat all these guys, and like it kind of had the reverse effect. It didn't make people like Hogan anymore. They were just like, why is Hulk Hogan beating everybody? So I'd say at first, Hogan didn't really put butts in seats. What do you think of it? Is this controversial to say?
Well, I don't know, because we were talking about WWF never pulling the trigger on Hogan and Flair, but like the very first feud that he had coming into WCW was against Ric Flair for the world title, and I guess that probably did put butts in seats, because that was the match that the majority of people haven't seen, and they wouldn't have known it was going to be the drizzling shits as well. So that it was a big deal to begin with, but then, like you say, they kind of ran into the same issues that WWF had with him, where the Hogan act kind of gets old pretty quickly, and fans start turning on him and growing tired of the same old shit. So, I'd say for a good couple of years, he basically wasn't really fulfilling that potential and putting butts in seats. But it wasn't until '96, when a certain event happened, that that all changed.
Which we will get to in a little second, because that totally plays into what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get to that, though, I want to just bring up a little point. We were talking about Randy Savage as well, jumping with, shortly after Hulk Hogan. I felt that, like, Savage would have had more of a, not a reach, but more of an interest, I think, for people. Because, like we said, Hulk Hogan, they saw him with Ric Flair, like, all right, cool. And then they were like, all right, it's the same old Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
We've seen this a lot. But Savage was always a bit more, like, unpredictable and more interesting than Hulk Hogan, who was a little bit one-dimensional, right?
Yeah.
I'm the good guy, but Savage was a little more interesting. So I would have thought that, like, Savage going to WCW would have been a big deal, because he's a big name, but, people still know who he is.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody talks about Macho Man, but I feel like they didn't use him properly.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you see?
Well,
What do you think about? Because that's a period of wrestling history that I'm not super familiar with.
I think the problem is Savage came in at the time where he could only ever be second fiddle to Hogan again. So,
But now he's third fiddle behind Hogan and Flair.
Well, he probably arguably kind of overtook Ric Flair as second fiddle, because I think Flair kind of got slowly shuffled around the card, and ended up getting pushed further and further down. But yeah,
we know where he ended up.
Yeah.
That part, he ended up in, like, didn't the NWO drop him in the desert or something?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they buried him alive at some point.
Buried him in the desert. Like, yeah, this will get somebody over. Why didn't they think of kidnapping him?
Yeah.
Why didn't they kidnap him? If you kidnap somebody, they're gonna get over. Right? Isn't that right, Tony Khan? It's all about the kidnapping. So, Savage. All right, Savage. I don't know about that one. Maybe, maybe not. We'll leave him in the maybe pile. So, in 1996, two guys who had found a lot of success in the WWF as compared to their previous runs in WCW had decided to leave the WWF. They had been enticed back to WCW with big money contracts, guaranteed contracts.
Mm-hmm.
They were very, very careful to lay out properly. They were like, we want guaranteed big money. And those two people were Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. So Nash and Hall were pretty big deals in the WWF, maybe not quite to the point of Hogan and Savage, but you could say that they were on their way. You know what I mean? Like, Nash was a former WWF champion, tag team champion. He was focused a lot. He was in the main event. He was featured heavily. See him with Scott Hall. He might not have been like the total, like, tip top main event scene, but he was super over. Former Intercontinental champion. Like, he was great. Like, they made their names there. And then they thought, no, we're going to go to the WCW and try that again because Oz was so much fun the first time. Who else was it? The Master Blaster?
That was his first one. He was also Oz.
Yes.
And Vinny Vegas as well.
Vinny Vegas, and then what was Scott Hall? Was he the?
He was the Diamond Stud, I believe.
See, I was gonna say the Diamond Stud, and then I'm like, was that Page? Diamond Dallas Page?
No.
But that was something. That was no. He had the mustache.
Yes,
Scott
yeah.
Hall had the mustache. So after those gimmicks, they were like, well, fuck them. Well, at least we'll be able to get some good money out of WCW. And so they jumped ship in a very infamous moment, I think, in wrestling history.
Mm-hmm.
It's inspired a lot of shit. Those two guys doing that move has a lot of stuff has come out of those two guys just changing company.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So they went to WCW, signed with them, featured very regularly, very heavily, for most of the rest of that company's existence.
Mm-hmm.
I think 2001. By 2001, both Nash and Hall were gone.
Yeah.
And Hogan was also gone.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1996, those motherfuckers are ready to roll. And that's when we seen the NWO form for the first time. We see Nash and Hall are now in the NWO. Who's the third man? It's only other ship jumper from WWF to WCW, Hulk Hogan. And then it really did feel like an invasion because the angle was these are WWF guys.
Mm-hmm.
That's what, Hogan was always a WWF guy, even though he found success in other companies as well. So that even when he was in WCW, they were like, he's a WWF guy. So when you see all three of them together, people were like, it's a WWF invading WCW. It was a really cool angle.
Yeah.
So by that point, yes, Hulk Hogan was putting butts in seats. But it had taken him, 4 years to get to that point?
Just 2 years, I think.
When did he come into it? 94?
Yeah, because he left WWE in 93 and then basically went to do Thunder in Paradise, and probably like some shitty movies. But then it wasn't until 94 that they finally signed him.
Oh my God, Thunder in Paradise, man. We're going to have to talk about that one at some point. Unbelievable. So we have all these three guys, and you would say that Nash and Hall jumping ship to WCW definitely put butts in seats.
No, yeah, it changed the business. Like,
hands down.
Without that happening and the formation of the NWO, you wouldn't have had like the catalyst for WCW kicking WWF's ass in the ratings for 83 weeks straight or whatever it was. You wouldn't have had the Monday Night Wars, essentially, as we, know and love them. So, yeah, absolutely.
We wouldn't have had some of the other things we talked about. You wouldn't have had Medusa, Rick Rude jumping ship like that.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for these guys. So you would say that's one of the more successful ones.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't all been like that.
No,
sir. But so far, these have been pretty high profile, names for the most part. But some of them just didn't move the needle. You know what I mean? Some of them were just not quite good enough.
Well, wasted opportunities as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about. See, what I like about this discussion is it's not at all in chronological order. So sometimes I'm like, should I make this chronological? No, fuck that. What we're gonna do is talk about TNA in 2010. Was it 2009 or 2010? When Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff went to TNA.
Yeah, it must be 2009, I think it was.
So, and Ric Flair went with him, I think.
Yeah, he followed soon after.
Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, X-Pac all went. Although I don't think Scott Hall lasted too long. No. The Nasty Boys.
Oh yeah, bloody hell! I forgot about them.
Oh boy, Hulk Hogan brought the Nasty Boys back. 2009/10. Like, I mean, on one hand, you shouldn't at all be surprised at that. But on the other hand, you're like, come on, man, right? It's 2010. This is what people didn't want you to do. So what happened was TNA were under new management, I suppose you could say. The new writers, new kind of staff putting it together, which were Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan.
Mm-hmm.
There was always the new creative force behind this company to really revitalize it. And a lot of people thought that this was a bad move because TNA were finally starting to get into a groove by that point. They had a really shitty start with Vince Russo and some wacky angles. And then at some point, it just got pretty good. It had good matches. It had good talent. You know, a lot of the storylines didn't make any sense. But the matches were good. And then whenever Bischoff and Hogan came in, a lot of people were worried about the state of TNA and whether or not they were... Because, like, if they were going to piss all that money away for Hogan and Flair, like, that's a lot of money. Those guys don't care. It come cheap, you know? Bischoff, all these people. Nasty Boys, notoriously. Boy, they are expensive, you know? But even, like, Hall and Nash, like, fucking, you know, Kevin Nash knows a paycheck when he sees it. He's not man. So, like, you know, you have to... I would imagine they would have had to shell out a lot for these people. And that's going to cut into, like, any kind of profits they had finally been starting to build up. You know? All that shit's out the window just so that these guys could come in. So they had to be able to justify this new spending of money with good quality storylines that made sense that would get the eyes of the people on TNA.
Yeah.
They did not do that. They not at all did that. That was not a fun time in wrestling. And some people that, you know, people have a tendency to look back on wrestling past with rose-tinted glasses and they say, you know what? Was it that bad? I don't think so. I think it was great. And I'm sure I can find people who will look back in TNA under the Bischoff era and say, you know what? It wasn't as bad as you think it was. Well, I remember watching it. I didn't like it because I was starting to like TNA. Like, there were good guys in there. You could see like Bobby Roode, you know, AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, Eric Young, Jim Storm. All these guys are like really good. And then when Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan came in, they kind of got, you know, shoveled under the radar. And it was a damn shame because TNA at that point were finally figuring out how to use established stars with their homegrown talent. That was the trick. And then they bring these fucking clowns in who take all the money and really didn't do a very good job of the product. So you would imagine all of those big names, Hogan, Flair, and Bischoff, and Nash and Hall. I mean, RVD, I think, came in around that time.
Yeah.
Should be big news, right? It should have made a big fucking difference.
Mm-hmm.
It should have. In your opinion, butts and seats?
No. I mean, like
it did the opposite.
Well, this is the thing as well. They kind of thought as soon as they brought in Hogan that this would be the turning point, and so it wasn't long after that they decided to move Impact to Monday nights to kind of try and restart the Monday Night Wars. And like the first episode they did, they did get huge ratings for Impact. They got like 1.5 million viewers or something. But then once they sort of started doing it regularly, that's when it started going wrong. Because, you know, if it's a choice between Impact and Raw, it just means that Impact's not going to get like, you know, the full audience that they could have potentially got. Because, you know, they're forcing the audience to split between them and Raw and make a choice. So they didn't do enough to kind of build on that, and they just kind of relied too much on, hey, look, it's Hulk Hogan. Hey, it's Eric Bischoff. Oh, and there's Rob Van Dam. It was like there wasn't any, necessary building of the brand really to kind of encourage viewers.
Exactly. It was just, here's these names. It wasn't like we're gonna change the business. It was just like, here's these guys you've seen for the last 30 years.
Yes.
Here they are again. And like, so like you said, yes, whenever they moved to Monday nights, they might have got like over 1 million, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't last. It didn't put butts in seats. It made a lot of people stop watching TNA.
Yeah.
And you can't like all Elite Wrestling have drew 1 million at some point, right? But since then, like I think they've hit 1 million like what, 3 times, 4 times.
Yeah, very rarely.
So like, and Sting appearing on that show generated a lot of buzz on my Twitter feed, but when it came to the ratings, it didn't break 1 million.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's interesting. Just having a name alone isn't enough to significantly boost ratings.
Yes.
Right? You can't just say Hulk Hogan's here and expect that to do the business, because you're like, well, what's he gonna do? And I think that was a point that both Bischoff and Tony Khan haven't quite figured out yet. Like, what do you do with these people after you get them? That's the hook. Because like, people will tune into the first episode to see Sting. They're gonna want to see the second episode to see what Sting does, right?
Yes.
If Sting doesn't do anything in the second episode, they're not gonna watch the third episode. Right? That's by that point, episode 3 or 4, after Sting's arrival, that's when you know what the ratings are really gonna be. So that's what you want to look at. And so Bischoff and Hogan, all these guys going to TNA, didn't put butts in seats, didn't raise attention enough. I really do feel like it was a detriment to that company. Like, it drove them backwards, which is a damn shame. Because some of the other people I'm going to mention were actually doing a good job of turning the tide. And I'd like to put forward 2 names for you: Christian Cage and Kurt Angle.
Yeah.
From the WWF/E, turned into the WWE at some point. They moved from the WWE to TNA and were really good because they were used properly. Although I think they went pretty heavy-handed with the Kurt Angle stuff.
You reckon?
Yeah, well, he won every single championship.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
does he have to win the tag titles by himself? Like,
I guess so. But I mean, he was the he was like one of the best wrestlers, arguably the best wrestler in the world, and he was the biggest name really that TNA had probably ever, in terms of like Sting. Okay, he had a lot of name value, but again, he'd been sort of out in the he'd been out of everyone's mind and off TV for so long that maybe he'd lost a bit of his kind of mystique, and he was only really good for the nostalgia. Whereas when TNA signed Kurt Angle, he was still in his prime, man. He was still putting on bangers, even though he was really banged up and had all of his addiction issues and whatnot, and he wasn't in a good like physical and mental state at the time, but in terms of in ring and delivering the goods, he probably had his best matches of his entire career in TNA.
Right, because they used Kurt Angle correctly for the most part. They had him do shit, they had him in storylines, and they had him wrestle people that he could have good matches with. Who's Hulk Hogan gonna have a good match with in 2010? Fucking nobody, right? But who's Kurt Angle gonna have a good match with in TNA in 2007 or 2006 or around that time? Turns out, fucking plenty of people.
Yeah.
Like Samoa Joe versus Kurt Angle, or AJ Styles versus Kurt Angle. These were all great. Even later, they had Bobby Lashley versus Kurt Angle. All of this shit was great, and it was starting to turn the tide. Like, that was the point, right? That was when TNA was great.
Yeah.
That point right there, because you got Angle just being out there doing what he did. You had more time for Christian Cage. You got to see what this fucker could do, and he was really good. And it was great. So they were using these old WWF, WWE guys correctly. They were using them to work with their talent and get good matches out of them, so that by the time Kurt Angle would retire, you've already got your AJ Styles and your Bobby Roodes to pick up the pieces. Same with Christian Cage. Same with the Dudley Boys. Came in and fucking helped that tag team division out immensely.
Yeah.
Right? And that's great because you need that legitimate tag team in that mix to show off like Beer Money and all these other guys, you know? LAX and stuff. Like that's perfect. So I'd say for guys like that, whenever it comes to like putting butts in seats, I mean, I'd say they kind of did because they were used properly. They didn't make TNA beat the WWE in ratings, but also I think you'll find if you go and look at those ratings, they were the best TNA ever had. So, you know, you can see my point here. So I think like having even Jeff Hardy, right, who I don't really care much for.
Yeah,
but he was given a chance, although he was given a lot of chances on WWE television to get over as well. So like, I don't know about that. But you see a guy like Christian, he really made a name for himself, and Kurt Angle just continued doing what he did, which was just kicking ass, right? So those two guys, they actively benefited the company they were hired for. And so I would say, yeah, those two guys made a difference. You know?
I'd say for Christian as well, it kind of made him a more complete wrestler. Like he was always good in the ring and always had good matches, but when he went to TNA and was given the ball and allowed to be like the main guy in the company, and at least until Kurt came along, you know, he rose to the occasion. And you saw when he came back to WWE then in like 2009 or whenever it was, but he was just like on a whole new level then. He was having great matches every single week, and it's almost a shame he's having them on ECW where, like, you know, hardly anyone was watching it. But
don't go besmirching the WCW or the ECW, the WWE ECW as they call it, because that was a great show.
Yeah, highly underrated show.
We talk about that a lot. That was a great show. It had so many. Let me think about it. Where that you saw, you know, Zack Ryder and Chavo Guerrero and William Regal and Christian
Braden
Cage.
Walker.
CM Punk. Big Daddy V. Oh, let me scratch that one too. Matt Striker. Oh. I mean, Matt Striker was good, but like, you know, he didn't amount to a whole lot, did he?
No one was paying to see Matt Striker.
No. Yeah, much is that, you know, that is what it is. So there's a couple of guys who I would say kind of moved the needle. Here's one for you, right? Mick Foley to TNA.
Right.
When was that? 2007? Ish?
Possibly.
I think that was right before the Hogan business.
Yeah, rings a bell.
What did you think of that?
It kind of felt a bit sad, to be honest. Like, you know, he retired from WWE. Well, officially retired, you know, back in 2001, I guess it was, but then came back for that kick-ass match with Randy Orton. And you know, that would have been a good way to just cap off his career and say, yep, that's me done. But him coming to TNA, I don't know, it just felt wrong in a way. I think it was mostly inspired by him just wanting to do something outside of WWE as well. Like he'd had like a really bad split from them because he was the color commentary guy on SmackDown, and he hated that so much, having Vince in his ear constantly telling him what to do, and it just made him miserable and kind of ruined their relationship in a way as well for a good few years. But I guess TNA was his chance to kind of stick it to Vince, and in retrospect, probably not a great decision, I guess.
Right. I mean, I'm the biggest Mick Foley fan ever, and when I saw him go into TNA, I felt like I felt the same as you did, dude. I'm like, Mick, you know, what are you doing? It did feel kind of sad because you're like you said, he retired in 2000 because he couldn't go any further. Like his body was broken, and I remember seeing all this stuff. And I'm like, he was right. You know, he got out at the right time. Like, he talks about that jump he did at WrestleMania 2000, where he does the old cactus elbow from like the ring apron to the announce table.
Yeah.
And he's like, dude, I didn't get anywhere near as close as I thought I could. You know, that was the point where I'm like, I can't do this anymore. And he did such a good job. Like, he would turn up for like Randy Orton match or like against Edge, I think. Like, they would do, you know, one-off appearances, and you're like, well, that's cool, man. It shows Mick Foley can still go, but you know, he's retired with like a certain amount of dignity, you know.
Yeah.
And then it really hurt to see him in TNA, and you watching him, you know, moving around the ring, and you're like, dude, you need to go home. Like, you've gone a little too far, you know. And I think he kind of realizes that too. It's a dang shame. But yes, again, like, they thought but like TNA were looking at Mick Foley, who, like we said, hadn't wrestled properly for 5-6 years and had to retire because of injury and because, you know, his body was beat up. I don't know why they thought that would be a good move.
I think maybe a part of it was the idea of putting him in the ring with Abyss, because they were like, you know, two of the more famous kind of mass scraggly wrestlers who, you know, competed in sort of hardcore matches and whatnot. And so maybe, you know, that was tempting to Mick Foley as well, to like try and pass the torch to Abyss, which I'm pretty sure they did have a few, didn't they?
I think so. But like, why couldn't they have just had, if Mick Foley was fed up doing the commentary in WWE, what if they had him as a commentator in TNA, a la The Big Show, and then organically have a rivalry with Abyss, who like takes objection to Mick, you know, referring to him on commentary. And then Abyss is like, I'm the real monster. You can't hold a candle to me. You're retired anyway. Yada, yada. And then bring Mick Foley out for like one last match against Abyss. That would have been fine.
Yeah.
But bringing it back as a wrestler and having him wrestle for 2 years, it doesn't
win
work.
the world title as well.
Yeah. Like, how? That doesn't work, dude. It didn't work, you know? So I would say, unfortunately, on this occasion, Mick Foley didn't put butts on seats.
No, definitely not.
That's a dang shame, because like I said, he's one of my favorites. Have you got any other ones you want to talk about?
Well, we've done guys going from WWE to TNA, but what about like a famous TNA wrestler ending up in WWE?
You already talked about Braden Walker.
Yeah. Technically speaking, AJ Styles had left TNA like about 3 years before he debuted in WWE, but I mean, he was pretty much the embodiment of TNA in many ways. Like, he was, you know, a homegrown star who was there from the start, involved in like loads of big storylines and kick-ass matches, and yeah, you know, he pretty much won every single thing he could have won in TNA, until, like, you know, their relationship went sour during their sort of financial troubles in I think it was like, you know, 2012, 2013, whenever it was. But yeah, so he kind of left TNA and then went off to Ring of Honor and New Japan, continued to do exceptional work there. But I'd say he was a guy who you never really expected to see in WWE. Like, you always hear about the WWE mold of they want big guys, they want body guys, you know. And AJ Styles is much smaller and sort of, you know, more known for his flying around the ring, which is sort of a style which doesn't, you know, tend to get pushed in WWE a lot, or at least it didn't until like this last 10 years or so.
Yeah. Now that's all they fucking push.
Yeah. But yeah, his debut at the Royal Rumble in 2016 felt like a huge moment, and he had that like huge reaction to kind of make him feel like a big deal. And I'd say he's been like a huge success story in WWE as well. Like
Yeah.
he's been pushed well and had championships and really good runs on top. So I think it's worked out nicely for him.
I would say he's done pretty well for himself. I agree with you for most of that. I think that for me, I think the reason I didn't see him in WWE was just because he was a TNA guy for so long. You know,
Mm,
like when you said TNA from the beginning of TNA till AJ Styles left, AJ Styles would have been probably the first name you would say, you know, and he was like the guy, you know,
mm,
when you thought of TNA, you thought of AJ Styles. And so even after he kind of went to Ring of Honor and New Japan and stuff like that, I always thought that I'm like, they're not going to sign him because he's too TNA. You
yeah.
know, he's too associated with that brand. And they did anyway. And you're like, well, you know, that was pretty cool because it got a lot more eyes on AJ Styles. And like you said, he's been able to go in there and have kick-ass matches with some people, been on top, like he's been used pretty well. AJ Styles has done pretty well for himself.
Hmm.
Got out of TNA. Smart dude. Smart dude. So I would say yes. AJ Styles has put some butts in seats. You would agree?
Absolutely.
Do you have any other guys going to WWF?
No.
No, that's it, because they grow their own stars.
Well, they do tend to really. I mean, WWE have signed like a lot of indie darlings over the last 10 years, which you kind of never really expected them to sign. But in terms of like moving the needle and, being regarded as a big thing amongst like all wrestling fans and not just like the small niche kind of indie fans or Ring of Honor fans or whatever. I wouldn't say they were like a huge deal and probably didn't put a lot of butts in seats, but
Mm.
I mean, even seeing guys like Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn and Adam Cole in a WWE ring is pretty bizarre even now, even though they've been there so long.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think Samoa Joe is probably the only other big name that you could look at and go, because because he had that TNA exposure kind of more than a guy like Kevin Owens. I know Bobby Roode was on TNA as well, but I'm like, I feel like Samoa Joe kind of had that name to it beforehand, you know.
Mm,
So I feel like once he came into but again, he's the kind of guy that I thought WWE would fucking love.
yeah.
Big fucking imposing dude. He's a Samoan. Beat the fuck out of people. You know, he's good on the mic. He's good in the ring. He's all he's got a great look all around. Like he'd be perfect for them. So I wasn't too surprised about him turning up. You know.
I think the only thing that held him back was injuries.
Mm. Yeah, I'm like watching that show. I'm like, is he still injured?
Apparently so.
Bullshit. Although he's good on the commentary.
Mm.
Can't argue with that. All right, I want to do one more.
Okay.
You. And this is a tricky one. If I were to say Mike Awesome to you,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say to me?
I'd say that 70s guy.
Oh, not the fat chick thriller?
I mean, it was a toss-up, but he looked pretty dashing as that 70s guy, I'd say.
Didn't they later put him in Team Canada?
They did. They shaved his mullet off as well, didn't they?
He's not Canadian. What I loved about WCW's Team Canada is like they had Lance Storm, Mike Awesome, Felix Skipper,
Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Yeah, Lance Storm's from Canada. So nice work, fellas. All right, let me tell you about Mike Awesome. So he was contracted to ECW,
Mm-hmm.
but he didn't like it there because they weren't paying him. According to Mike Awesome, he said they didn't pay him. So he secretly negotiated a contract with WCW while he was the ECW champion. So on an episode of Nitro, he just turned up. I can't remember if he had the belt with him, but he was just on an episode of Nitro. And obviously, ECW were pretty pissed off about this. WCW also weren't super happy about this because they were like, now they're entangled with some legal shit they didn't want to get entangled with.
Mm.
So they had to come up with a compromise. And the bizarre compromise they came up with was they were going to have a show in ECW involving current ECW champion and also current WCW employee Mike Awesome, and he would lose the WCW championship to Taz, a former ECW champion who was currently contracted to the WWF. And so then that allowed Mike Awesome, once he dropped the belt to Taz, that allowed Mike Awesome to go back to work the WCW with no contractual obligations. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense because now the belt's on Taz, who works for the WWF. And he did appear on WWF television wearing the belt.
Yeah.
And that didn't end up too well for him. So then he had to drop the belt like a week or two after that to, I can't even remember who he dropped the belt to. Was it Tommy
Dreamer? Yeah.
Tommy
who
Dreamer.
Then lost it 20 minutes later to Just Incredible.
Yes. Like, just put it on Credible. Go straight there. Like, for all the faffing around that went on to get Mike Awesome in your company, to then just give him a bus and make him the 70s guy. Like, what the fuck? Like, all the effort they went to get him. That's what they did with him. I think it's safe to say Mike Awesome did not put butts in seats.
No, definitely not. But I heard that it was Kevin Nash who was maybe, I don't know, feeling a bit threatened by this, like, you know, really tall, athletic guy who could do things that he couldn't do, coming in with like a bit of buzz, and was just like, yeah, I think we should make him the Fat Chick Thriller, guys. What do you think?
I haven't heard that one. That's an interesting one. But also remember that Vince Russo was booking.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So he you know, you have to give everybody a character. Vince is great at coming up with stupid characters, so there you go. I don't know if you heard this. I heard Booker T talking about Paul Heyman, and he was talking about how good Paul Heyman was at recognizing people's strengths and highlighting that to cover their weaknesses. And he was like, yeah, but Paul Heyman was great at that. He could take a really good work or a really shitty worker and make it seem like they're a great worker. But once you get in the ring with somebody like Mike Awesome, it turns out you realize that they're not a good worker. I'm like, well, that's interesting that he name dropped Mike Awesome, right?
Yeah.
I find that really interesting because Mike Awesome didn't work out well in WCW and he didn't work out well in WWF. And I'm like, is that just because they didn't like Mike Awesome, or is it because maybe Mike Awesome just wasn't that good?
Yeah, he was good in
a spectacle.
His situation, like the matches with Masato Tanaka. Fantastic, so entertaining.
Exactly. Well, this is the thing. Me and Bryce were doing a Mike Awesome episode on the Making Kayfabe, so I was researching Mike Awesome, and he used to work for, what was that company in Japan? FMW?
FMW, yeah.
Yes. Which could be described by some members of the wrestling community as outlaw macho garbage wrestling. Certain people would say that, not necessarily me. And that, you know, that all has a place in history. Like, that's fun to watch. It's a good spectacle, but you can't build your company around people like that, and you can't make a promotion that's just all that. You know, people are going to see through it. That ruins the point of it. So I think that, like, yes, Mike Awesome could definitely do some spectacular things, but maybe as a wrestler, it didn't all gel, you know?
Yeah.
So Mike Awesome did not put butts in seats. Sorry, buddy.
Definitely not.
Well, he tried, you know, hit Masato Tanaka pretty hard. So those are only some of the ship jumpers, people who jump from company to company to try and get a little bit more popularity, notoriety, or money sometimes. And there's probably a bunch of other ones.
We didn't even mention Bret Hart, but I mean, everyone knows that deal anyway. So
yeah, I mean, and also, you know, that didn't put butts in seats because they fucked it up.
Oh, massively.
Good God, did they fuck that up? And that's what we're saying. Just having a name there isn't good enough. You can't just say, we got Bret Hart. I'm like, cool. Bret Hart used to be good when he fought against all those other people he fought against. Is that going to happen this time? Like, probably not. You know?
Well, that he should have been like the most hottest thing in the wrestling business. Like, considering he's been screwed over and everyone's talking about him, it should have been like a slam dunk. But WCW, how do they bring him in? They kind of just because he can't compete for 60 days after his contract ran out with WWF, he can't do anything. So he comes in and he's like the referee in a Eric Bischoff versus Larry Zbyszko match at Starrcade.
You say that as if people don't want to see Eric Bischoff versus Larry Zbyszko. Yeah, there were mistakes were made. I think that's a whole episode by itself, the Bret Hart and WCW thing. So I think what we'll do is we'll wrap things up for now, if that suits you.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap things up for now. We'll probably be back next week with another episode that's a secret. You're going to have, if you want to know what it is, you're going to have to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at whatever the Twitter handle is. It's in the description. And you'll see what the next episode is, and it'll be great. We might talk about Bret Hart and WCW. It's coming eventually. But we'll be back next week with another fantastic episode. If there's any people who jump ships that you guys were thinking about that we didn't cover in this episode, let us know in the comments below, and we'll read them, and we'll give you a little kiss. But we're going to say thank you very much for listening, guys. We're going to see you next week for another episode. And that's it. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.